Okay, I think we are ready to welcome our two speakers and our audience. I'm Trine Flockhart. I'm the co-director of the Center for War Studies and a professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Southern Denmark. And we have started a new form of events, and this is the second one in a row of Insight Conversations, where the idea is that we pick a topical topic of the times and ask a practitioner, who in this case is Ambassador Rolf Holmboe, and a scholar, who in this case is Professor Sten Rynning, to discuss and have a conversation about the topic that we're looking at. And today we will be looking at the Forever Wars, asking the question, what comes after the Forever Wars? So the format of this is that Rolf and Sten will open up with some short statements and answer some quick questions. And there will also be the possibility for you to comment on what the other person says. So it should be a conversation between the two of you. But there's also the opportunity for our audience to ask questions, which I would ask you to do in the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your screen. So if we have time and if it fits in with the way the conversation is flowing, then I will relay those questions to you. But for now, it's really just to start on the topic. And I should also say, I'm not going to introduce you in any detail. I will just say that Rolf is speaking to us from Mali. Sten is speaking to us from Odense. I'm in Sweden, and I think Amelie is in Copenhagen. So we really are coming from, I wouldn't say all over the world, but certainly we are not sitting together in a cozy room at SDU, which is what we would normally have done if it hadn't been for the pandemics. So the background for choosing to ask this question, what comes after the Forever Wars? Well, it is, what do we do about something like Forever Wars? What do we mean by the term Forever Wars? But also it is more concretely the fact that President Biden back in April announced that that the United States will pull out of Afghanistan after 20 years of war in Afghanistan. But not only did he announce that the United States will pull out, he actually also questioned the whole foundation for the United States being there and for the background for the war. So this prompts me, I think, to start by asking Rolf, what were the reasons behind the Forever Wars? And perhaps you could also just say very briefly, what do we mean by it? But why do we have these Forever Wars?
Well, basically, I think Forever Wars is a term that has been coined in the view, especially of Afghanistan. You could also argue Iraq. Basically, wars where the objectives change, the objectives are not met, the mode of operating changes, but it just goes on, and you cannot really see that anything is happening that will allow us to move to an exit state. That we can make a strategy for our own exit. I think that sort of covers the concept of Forever Wars, and it really goes back to also how we got into these Forever Wars. One thing is we had this historical legacy that which is very linear, that you can do a war, then you can do a peace, then you can do reconstruction and development, and then you move into a liberal democratic society, which worked very well after the Second World War, the two main protagonists being now fully integrated into the world community, Germany and Japan. And it also worked to some extent, in the Balkans, in the interventions we had in the Balkans. But after 9/11, something changed. We had these interventions. If you point to Iraq, Afghanistan, you can even point to Libya, you can say that they achieved regime change. but it was in societies where there was a very strong status quo. And this status quo was disrupted. And when you disrupt a status quo, you have a power play. When you have a power play without an overlying strong force that can mitigate this, you have anarchy, and that makes the situation just so much worse. The other one you can also say from Afghanistan. I'm sure that Sten will mention this, but if you take a main protagonist like the Sunni government and regime in Iraq, or like the Taliban in Afghanistan, and you kick them out, how do they not become your enemy? And this is different from what we did in World War II and in the Balkans, where we really invited the enemies of before into the solution. So I think sort of key takeaways from this is, I mean, we have to look at the societies we're working in, what will happen with those societies, and we have to look, how do we actually bring the protagonists into the tent for solving this. Another one I would also say, as we move on, basically you had a situation where we believed we could do this by military means almost alone. And as things moved on, we found out a little late that we cannot do this only by military means. We invented stabilization, but stabilization has not reached a level yet where you can say that it is really effective. And that has many other reasons. These are just a few things I would like to sort of highlight on the reasons behind. There are many other and very complex sort of dynamics behind them, of course.
Oh, thanks very much. I mean, what I take from that is that forever wars is not really so much about their longevity. It's more about what their background and the way that they are conducted. The premise upon which you are engaged in an intervention within a sovereign state. And I suppose if I turn to you, Sten, this kind of asks or begs the question: if that is the case, will forever wars, despite their name, will they ever go away? And what if anything, have we learned from the forever war in Afghanistan, for example?
Well, thank you, Trine. Well, the short answers are yes, and it's complicated. So yes, the forever wars will go away, but it's not new to us that political antagonisms can last for a very long time, and they can become institutionalized, and they can become, very enduring. The Cold War lasted for 50 years. Sometimes it was hot, sometimes it wasn't. And I think the forever wars, as Rolf was saying, is very much a reflection of where we are in our own thinking on the wars that we happen to become engaged in after the Cold War. And the reason why we have forever wars is this sense of disillusionment that we had a lot within our grasp, but somehow we fumbled the football. And when you look back to the 1990s, when these wars sort of crept in on us, part of it was that we were, as a Western community, were very powerful. We had a supreme opportunity to shape other political settings, and thus our ambitions grew. That the solution to war was not to defeat an enemy, it was to rebuild society and rebuild government. So that was pushing the ambition, even though it was a courageous choice, you might say. And the exhaustion after years and years of doing that is the term forever wars. That even in our supreme moment, we couldn't do it, and somehow we got some of that wrong. And that points to the lesson from Afghanistan as well. I'd say it's very, you have to be very courageous to say that there's one set of lessons coming out of Afghanistan. But nonetheless, I think there's a clear sense that Afghanistan as an intervention was under politicized and over militarized, and we didn't get the politics of Afghanistan right. We sought to build a republic, the Bun Republic that was defined in the early 2000s, without the Taliban, and without factoring in Pakistan and how we wanted to work with Pakistan, and this we entirely fumbled. And instead we, with our supreme ability to close our eyes and invest, very Protestant of us, we just poured more resources into the intervention, and so we over militarized it. And I think one of the key lessons coming out of Afghanistan, I think is widely recognized, is we need to make our decision-making processes at home in the capitals, and then in Brussels or wherever we have our collective institutions. We need to make them more robust. They have to test with civil-military interaction, critical dialogue, and sort of have a robust process for thinking through all the pros and cons of what we do. It's not that's all about process, but I think that is being implemented almost across the board.
Okay, so I see between the two of you, actually, there's quite a lot of agreement. And one of the things that you both seem to be highlighting is the failure in these interventions that start happening from the 1990s onward to include the whole of the society that you're dealing with, that you are actually almost by definition creating opposition to your task at hand within the societies that you're dealing with. Is that the main fault of, is that what has gone wrong mainly? That I suppose that's blowback that we're talking about here, that there will be some form of blowback if you do those sorts of things. Rolf, I should.
Yeah. Okay. Sort of a short reaction. I mean, the tendency would be to look at Afghanistan as a failure, and also other situations. But if you look from the point of departure from the political discourse when Denmark went into Afghanistan, it was to fight terrorism and to make Afghanistan safe from not becoming a terrorist hub again. And if you look to some of the big interventions we've had, I mean, this we have achieved in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, by the talks now going on between the Americans and the Taliban, it will not become a hub, not in any foreseeable future anyway, for terrorism again. If you look to not the main Iraq intervention, but if you look to Inherent Resolve, which was this much more lean sort of military engagement that went in to fight the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, this was also had this specific target, not allowing any terrorist extremist movement to have a hub from where they could spread terrorism around the world. This was also a success. And I'm now sitting in Mali, where we are fighting the same fight, which basically is against both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, that are trying to establish a hub in the Sahel-Sahara area of Africa, where you have very fragile states, and they can move between states and find safe havens. So in that sense, if you look at it also, in the evolution, I mean, we have perhaps a little more reduced sort of ambitions at this point in time, and have stepped down a little from the sort of total regime and systems change into a new liberal democratic party, simply recognizing that countries in the Balkans and in Europe are at a different level, and society is perhaps more receptive to installing both a liberal economy and democracy than countries in the part of the world where we fought sort of the forever wars since 9/11.
Okay, so it comes down to how far you can push Western values, really, is perhaps what I hear you saying there.
Yeah, you can say, I mean, we're looking at reduced, sort of reduced ambitions right now. We're focusing much more on containment than on actual change.
Okay. Sten, do you want to add anything to this?
Well, I think it's not simple, and I think that's one of the lessons that cultural and historical diversity, strategic distance, or when you travel across geographies, that all matters. And I would be hesitant to call the Balkan interventions a failure, even though they have surprised governments by way of the investment they have required over decades. I was counting in preparation of this, pretty soon we will be up to 3 decades in Bosnia, and that's closing in on the Cold War in terms of length. But I think governments would agree that that has paid off, even though it's far from perfect. And where it Western policy has become more humble is once you move outside of a, broadly speaking, sort of the Euro-Atlantic Western sphere, and sort of this sense that we don't know other societies well enough to have big ambitions on their behalf. And when you go in big, especially when you go in with military force, you tend to own the mission, and you can listen, but you own it, and so it sort of your thinking becomes predominant. And I think one of the main trends in Western interventions or stabilization policy has been the desire to work through regional organizations, to work through regional partners, and to invest more in the local actors who know the scene and who must own the scene, and also to never again do what we happened to do with Pakistan, namely that Pakistan was so consequential for what happened in Afghanistan, and yet we never figured out whether it was more important to us to prevent Pakistan from interfering in Afghanistan, which would mean that Afghanistan was our priority, or whether it was more important to stabilize Pakistan because it was a nuclear state. So Pakistan would be the #1 priority. We never sorted that out, and that left Pakistan with scope to interfere with our priorities. And so that's another lesson, that you have to think through these regional security settings before you go in. And that again is part of the complexity and the history and the geography.
Of course, but in most cases, of course, as you say, going into some of these difficult situations, in most cases, you could argue that there isn't a choice on whether you go in there in the first place, because usually what you're faced with is a desperate situation that requires some form of stabilization, some form of humanitarian aid, some sort of immediate problem solving, and putting a band-aid on a situation. So it would probably be naive to think that, well, we should just leave these situations alone. We are going to be pulled into these situations again and again and again, I would imagine. So this prompts me to ask, well, how do you think we should rethink stabilization efforts for underpinning new upcoming interventions, new unstable situations, which may be in your neighborhood, Rolf, where you're sitting right now? Are there better ways of doing it than what we've done in the past?
Well, I think actually we are already moving sort of in that direction. I mean, at a better balance between the military engagement, the stabilization engagement, and as necessary development engagement. And just to mention, I mean, Sten was mentioning the Balkans. We've been there for decades. But I would also argue, like Sten, that it's been a success. I mean, this has been a good process. It has come out on the right side. I don't think we really mind investing if it comes out on the right side. So that's sort of one thing. I would say, I mean, we are focusing much more on containment in the missions that you see, like in Libya, like the one we have down here. We don't want any safe havens for terrorism. We cannot live with that. We cannot live with situations that create massive irregular migration flows. This is a political priority from our part of the world. We cannot live with piracy, and Denmark is one of the countries, or the country most affected by piracy in the entire world, because we have such a big merchant fleet. And we cannot live with transnational crime that also tends to foment instability and link up to other agendas in a very, very unholy cocktail. So but we have to sort of find out how we do it. And we're looking now at a move towards coalitions of the willing. You have a French initiative in Europe, you have a German initiative in Europe, you have a British initiative in Europe trying to, on various aspects of it. Here in the Sahel, we have a coalition of the willing. It is a French-led anti-terror operation, Operation Barkhane, and Denmark just made a decision a few days ago of joining a special forces element of Operation Barkhane, which is called Task Force Takuba, which has good promises of being actually quite effective against the terrorists. So this is also, we also see like an inherent result in Syria working much more by, with, and through the special forces in inherent result, which also included Danish forces, working with Kurdish forces against the Islamic State, mentoring them, giving them fire support, air support, but a very small force actually achieving quite large results. And then, of course, I mean, you can also just have a muddle through sort of model. So you go in and you muddle through a little bit. I would highlight my own experiences from Gaza. If you look what happened, this is sort of quite recent as well, how how Israel is handling Gaza. They know they cannot go in and clean up the problem with military means. This is not feasible. So, so basically, what they're doing is a military doctrine which is known as cutting the grass, or mowing the lawn. So once in a while, I mean, things grow up too much, and you have to go in and you cut the grass and you leave again. And this is what Gaza has, what has happened in Gaza since I was there back in 2005 and 2009. Kaselet was the first big military operation Israel conducted into Gaza back in 2009. And this has been recurrent every so-and-so years, sort of ever since. They're just cutting the grass. And then, of course, you have what we also see down here right now. Some would like to invite the Russians in because they don't follow the rules of engagement. And they don't feel bound by the rules of law or international humanitarian sort of law. What we saw in Syria, they can just bomb with just impunity. And others see that this is much more effective than our forces that take the Geneva Conventions and the international humanitarian law seriously. So you have also a new type of competition about what sort of military engagement that the countries are sort of looking for around the world. This will also be a parameter. We're seeing this in Africa right now, but we can also see, we saw it in the Middle East about 10 years ago with Iran and Russia moving into Syria, basically demonstrating that if you're willing to bomb a civilian population, you can win against an asymmetric enemy.
Sten, do you want to comment on this?
If I may.
Yes.
I think what we have seen, and thus what is the future ahead of us, is that when it comes to the the area in Northern Africa, the Middle East, the emphasis has been on selecting key partners that have institutional capacity, and then build up that capacity, strengthen it by robust security institutions, government decisions, and security forces, and draw them into a partnership where you socialize each other's thinking, so that you actually get moderate and constructive policy coming out of it, and a capacity to carry out policy, and thus you work through local partnerships and to get capacity building. Now that has mixed with what has happened in Eastern Europe, where we have forever war now in the shape of Russian revisionism seeking proxies to take stabs at the West, and these are again failed states and forever wars, but they're fueled by great power revisionism, and these two logics have met and merged in Syria, and where the West is coming to term with this is in terms of thinking through how forever wars in failed states mix and mingle with forever wars or hybrid wars driven by great power interest, and we have to get used to that mix and mingling. It's the new hybridity, hybrid 3.0, if you will. And 3.0 will also be marked by the entry of China into this equation, because the road and belt initiatives of China, the way they built that up, and they're not going to be happy just to have infrastructure. They want to politicize that and build up their partnerships, means that we have to think through and engage what it means to be in these neighborhoods where China is also present. and will pursue its interests. And I'm not saying this is going to be a new global Cold War, but it means that you have to think through all the dimensions of rivalry in these contexts. And as I said, it's a hybrid situation where all our categories of thought will be challenged, and we need that agility, both in terms of academics and policymakers, to make sense of this.
So does that mean then that not only has there been a realization that perhaps the stabilization processes as undertaken from the 1990s and the 2000s and onwards perhaps were too ambitious and perhaps were not approaching the issue in the right way, but now there's also a change coming from the outside that it is just absolutely inconceivable for the future that stabilization processes can be basically Western projects. Is that a correct interpretation of what you're saying, Sten?
I think stabilization early on was very much north-south. It was about bringing development to unhappy people in failed states south of the border. And what that encountered radical violence, terrorism, which sort of broke the framework. And so we had to have stabilization with counterterrorism. And once we learned that, and once we sort of gave up on that with the Forever War label, we encountered stabilization with radical violence and great power interest. And so here we are. So I think what I'm saying is that it lives on, but the challenge has evolved in a significant way, and it has only gotten more complicated. And our resource base has diminished. We have fewer resources and less political weight and patience.
And probably less political will as well.
Less political will.
I'm very conscious of this is a very short format on purpose, but we have one question from the audience, and I think it would be fitting to end with a question from the audience. It's not strictly speaking on forever wars. It is a question for Rolf, which is, what is the Danish government's position on the current military leadership in Mali? And I guess as we have you here, Rolf, it would be a shame not to ask you that question.
That is a question that is evolving. I mean, right now you had a coup, a military coup situation, which happened over all of the days of last week. And then you have the regional organization, which is sort of the main organization that supported by the international community that is handling the transition process in Mali. They had a summit on this Sunday, 2 days ago, and they decided in the choice between a hard reaction to the military intervention and the principled reaction to a military coup, with sanctions and so forth that would impoverish the country and actually give it less ability to work itself out of the military coup. They opted for the other side, which basically is to hold the transitional authorities to the time plan for the transition. And in the first coup back in August of 20, it was basically said that you have 18 months, and then you will make in those 18 months elections that are free and fair, leading towards a transition of power to a democratically elected government. So what has happened now? I mean, they have taken power. They've dismissed the president and the government. They will put in a new civilian government, but the key coup maker, Colonel Goiter, he will be leading the transition as de facto president. And but on the other hand, he has given sort of clear assurances that he will respect the timeline of the transition. He will respect the need for democratic elections. And sort of basically there's 9 months left of this period. It goes to March 22, and then basically they will relinquish power. So now ECOWAS is looking to get very firm guarantees from the transitional authorities that this is the case. And if this is the case, ECOWAS has recommended that we continue to work with the transitional authority, because if we don't, then we can be sure that the transition will not work. And if this happens, we will have a much larger crisis than the one we have now. So the idea is to keep the transition going and avoid a total collapse of the country that would put it basically in arm's reach of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Nobody really wants that.
Okay. So we should get back to you in March and see what has happened, and whether it will develop into, well, into a more democratic and stable situation, or whether we will have the need for a stabilization intervention, which hopefully not. We are out of time. I want to thank both of you for participating in this initiative, and I really hope that we will be able to catch you when you're back in Denmark, Rolf, to get you to come to SDU and to talk to our students, which I know they would absolutely be delighted if that was possible. And Sten, also thank you to you. We will of course see more of you in these conversations, and thank you to Emily for making it all happen. So thank you very much, everyone, and thanks to our small but excellent audience.